and fire, and also that everyday kinds of remembrance practices are all together a form of potential resilience and resistance at the same time.
Welcome back to the Commons for Justice podcast, the show that aims to engage the community in crucial, complex, and sometimes controversial discussions about the past, present, and future of race, risk, and resilience in coastal communities. I'm your host, Genai Witter, and today we are exploring the intersection of race, risk, and resilience in Indigenous communities in South Florida and Okinawa with Dr. Mitzi Carter. Dr. Carter is a cultural anthropologist whose passion lies at the intersection of East Asian studies and the African and African diaspora through her global learning courses. She serves as the interim director of the Global Indigenous Forum and also oversees the grant's Global Indigenous Podcast Network. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Carter. I created this podcast to uncover the stories of the past, present, and future of race, risk, and resilience in South Florida. And to do that, I feel like we need to journey back to where it all began, South Florida's Indigenous communities. In the FIU News article, The Land We Are On by Laura Ramos, you said, Miami is on land that has been respected and cherished by Native peoples for more than 10,000 years, and they continue to cherish it today. I think it's important to acknowledge that truth, to sit with it, and really let it sink in. For 10,000 years, Indigenous people have lived on this land and loved it. Yet, the expertise, history, and traditions of Indigenous people have been systemically overlooked, and they're continuously denied a seat at the table that they built. You know to this as you emphasize the responsibility to uphold the knowledge of the, quote, original stewards of the land, and I really want to dive into that.
Yeah, stewardship is interesting. I know people use that a lot in like land acknowledgments and don't really think about what that means. I mean, we've grown up and live in such a capitalist environment. The idea of stewardship and being a caretaker is almost a very foreign concept. Mm-hmm. We talk about ownership, right? In a capitalist, we own this land, and so stewardship is more about, being in this kind of holistic relationship with the land and really truly being a caretaker. So when Indigenous people say we're caretakers of this land, there's a different relationship than just ownership. And exactly. So Native folks who've lived here, Tekesta Calusa, today, the Seminole Miccosukee, have been making sure that the land is healthy as much as they can, given all the challenges we face today. So this idea of really kind of thinking about what it means to be a true caretaker is really critical today. And when we're talking about resilience, you have to think about the ways that we are in relationship with each other. To be able to imagine a world that's different. But here, I think in South Florida, it's clear that it has to do with paying attention to the ways that Native people have long cared for this land, not erasing them from the conversations around what resilience means from an Indigenous perspective, right? Recognizing these kinds of common values for cultural preservation and a good life, and really kind of acknowledging all our relations. And the only way you can recognize that is by listening to Indigenous voices.
And that's the exact idea behind my term, the duality of expertise. I feel like far too often, professional expertise automatically gets a seat at the table. Yet, as I said previously, the thousands of years of experience and expertise of Indigenous people are arbitrarily overlooked and they're left out of critical discussions, even though, as you said, they are the original stewards of the land. And I feel like recognizing that and integrating that duality of expertise is at the heart of the FIU CFJ Collaboratory. But how do you think other organizations or academic endeavors can work to recognize and integrate these common values and Indigenous perspectives?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll give you an example. We had a film screening last year with business school, and we brought the filmmaker for Path of the Panther out. And when we were starting to plan it, immediately I was like, okay, we got to bring Betty Osceola into conversation. And we had several folks who were lined up from the scientific community, academic scholars, intellectuals, right? And she's like, look, wait, what about our scientists? Just laying it straight, saying we know you've got your people, well, we've got our people too. And so make sure that there is space for them, that they have equal or even more talking time. In the ivory tower, decide who we're going to have. And the planning occurs here and not in a communal kind of fashion. So, bringing people to the table in the planning session is critical in opening those spaces so that people can be in dialogue with each other. The other way is for people to actually go into the communities. And I know that's starting to happen a little bit more, going to the reservations and talking to the folks there on the ground who've been doing it for so long and studying, not just from a lived experience, but also from, these are PhDs, these are
exactly.
And they've got both, the benefit of having both, this ancestral kind of knowledge that's been passed down. They're in the community, they see how climate change is impacting, their lives on an everyday level. And so it's important for not just to expect, folks who are there to come out and go and meet academics in a university setting.
Yeah.
We've got to make that effort to go and, be on the ground in these communities as well. It's about setting aside ego and I think also, and, in academia. So that's one thing, is just really being kind of understanding how our own ethnocentric kind of values are shaping our academic outlook.
So going back to same FIU article, you emphasize the importance of supporting local Indigenous communities in their efforts and how important it is for the university community to do that. So I want to talk about how FIU's Commons for Justice plays a role in this work, and how does parts of the grant aim to collaborate with Indigenous communities?
I think one of the things that we're doing is leveraging our relationships that we already have, instead of kind of forcing our way in and saying, hey, we want you to do this. And we've already have this a really beautiful relationship with many of our board members who are Indigenous and leaders within their own communities. So we've reached out to them and say, hey, would you lead a podcast on this area of expertise? We're having conversations. We're basically asking different stakeholders to create the content themselves, and we'll support them. That was our way of being involved and working with the communities.
So that's a perfect segue. I want to give you a chance to plug the podcast a little bit. So can you shed some light on what the podcast is about and how it aims to bridge local and global Indigenous perspectives together?
Yeah, so the podcast is called Global Indigenous Podcast Network. And like our forum, which has the term global in it, it's this recognition that, there are Indigenous people all over the world, right? And they're all completely different, right? Many of them are of course, we're in different continents, and there are some issues that are common to most of us, right? First of all, most of the folks who we're interviewing are here in South Florida, but there are perspectives that are important from let's say Okinawa, and they are dealing with the same kinds of issues in Okinawa regarding, colonization issues, contamination, toxic pollutants impacting their everyday lives. And how is it that people there are strategizing and fighting and creating new solutions? And how can maybe activists in communities here, learn tidbits or work with those communities to make some change?
Yeah.
And so those are the kinds of conversations that we want to highlight when it comes to global local connections. For the most part, the interviews that we are doing are local. And so these are folks who are really thinking about resilience in creative ways, whether it be from, how do you decolonize the word native planting, native gardening, to, how our youth, Indigenous youth here, whether they be Seminole or Miccosukee, approaching resilience and risk from their own perspectives. What are they doing today to organize on their own terms? Let's see, we're working with the farm working and nursery community down in the Homestead and Redland area.
Okay.
And most of those folks are Indigenous from Central America or southern parts of Mexico. And so putting them in conversation with one of our board members, Samuel Tommy, who's Seminole, is going to be really interesting because, there's a sharing that's going to emerge as they are in conversation with each other. And not just sharing, but this feeling of like, I hear you and I really hear you, and been the kind of goal of this podcast is to really kind of bring out the Indigenous perspectives on race and risk and resilience, and be able to shape a different narrative, even from the start, from just the way that the questions are posed.
Okay, I'm glad you brought up Okinawa because I really want to get into that. I think your research is incredibly interesting, and I really wanted to explore how your African American and Okinawan heritage have impacted your journey in the realm of cultural anthropology, and also your approach when researching issues both in Okinawa and worldwide.
I think because I grew up in the United States, like you said, Black father and an Okinawan mom, I didn't really understand Okinawa academically until I went to college, but I understood it from, just listening to and absorbing all of these stories about this island, but hearing it from totally different perspectives. My dad talked about Okinawa as a space in a militarized lens. He was in the Air Force. And so, and he went to Okinawa during the time when the U.S. was so it was such a violent place. I mean, he went to Okinawa right when the Woolworth, protests were happening, the Woolworth counter protests. And so it was just, he wanted to go and he signed up. He wasn't drafted. He went and signed up because he used to tell us, I didn't want to shine shoes and deliver newspapers and be in this kind of subservient kind of position in Texas where he grew up. And so he saw Okinawa as this kind of place of escape, almost as a place where you didn't have to be really totally fragmented as a person, right? Meanwhile, my mom, who grew up as a war survivor, she survived the Battle of Okinawa, which was a really devastating battle for the island. It was the only land invasion during the World War II fight with Japan. And so almost a third of the population was killed. And it was awful. And she grew up in this little, like right on the water, right where the U.S. troops landed. And so, so many of our family was killed in that months. And her version of Okinawa is a scarred kind of battleground, but also this place of rituals and hope and of survival, and it's all mixed in and humor, and it was this very full version of the island, right? And it wasn't just like base Gate 2 or down in Kadena Air Force Base, or those land markers. Even the naming of the sites were completely different. Like her name for a park was an Okinawa name, and his version was like to Gate 2. And so it was really interesting to me as when I became an anthropologist to think about all of these multiple ways of being and belonging and creating life along these fence lines, right? This is an island that has been split up by militarized fence lines. And how do people make sense of this idea of security that is like pushed down on people?
Yeah.
Like all of these ideas about what and how people create life along these militarized borderlands really is at the crux of my research, and thinking through, how people make sense of militarization really been important to me. And so the way that I'm trying to connect that in this grant, as I'm thinking about like listening to everybody's stories, I'm like, gosh, so this is what happens in Okinawa. These are the processes that, you can see that all over the world, there's similar processes of making people illegible, right? Mm-hmm. That happen in order for the powers that be to kind of railroad through an area, right? You make it seem like it's a sacrificable area, that this is not that's important to you.
That they're disposable, kind of.
That they're disposable. Mm-hmm. Or that, you cropped up here after we built this. So
exactly.
There's similar it happens so often in so many different places around the world. When you study that and you read stories and you hear people talking about it in these kind of like, in Okinawa we call it yundaku, which means like this open, other people have this in other cultures, like talk story, like where you just it's an equal kind of, it's this kind of egalitarian way of conversing with each other. So you're like really opening up in a community. Yeah. You hear those same processes of being oppressed, and you also in those conversations hear, okay, we're not having this anymore, right? Mm-hmm. And when I did work in Vieques, for instance, I was listening to people on the battlefield, like going out, cutting through the fence lines and sitting as an act of civil disobedience on the bombing ranges, or fishermen going out into the water saying, you're not going to practice doing these bombing sessions on our land anymore. Mm-hmm. There's a depleted uranium in these bombs. This is dangerous. This is why we have a high rate of leukemia. And then seeing Okinawan fishermen there, going, why are there Okinawans here? And they're sharing because they said, this is what is happening in our island. This is how we do it. And they invited the Vieques fishermen to come out to Okinawa, and these activists, and they shared. And there's this beautiful moment of like engagement, kind of serendipitous. It was like, wow, look at what we can do together if we, we don't even speak the same language, but we know what it looks like to be terrorized, right? And so how can we talk to each other so that we can strategize? And those are the kinds of conversations that always pop up when I'm thinking about what's happening with the grant, which is a beautiful grant, because it's all about like, how are all of these just diverse communities dealing with that similar issue, right? They all have different cultural practices, they have different needs, they have different community, like racial and ethnic communities, but there's something there that we can all learn from each other, because it's too big if we're all doing it separately. Right?
Exactly. No change will come. We have to do it together. And I think that's the reality for a lot of smaller nations or smaller towns or, groups of people. We kind of overlook the United States' like role in these countries or these states, and how our presence can completely uproot entire groups of people. So I really want to take a second and just like keep educating people on this a little bit. So how has this history of militarization in Okinawa, how has it influenced the social fabric and resilience of the Okinawan people? Specifically, this kind of tug of war between the occupied and the occupiers, So I really want to know how this shapes the narrative, how Okinawans deal with this and be resilient at the same time.
Yeah, it's a really long history of Okinawa being positioned as almost second class, or, Okinawa was an independent kingdom. It was a Ryukyu kingdom. And so, and they had a tributary relationship with China for a long time. And then they were, big group of samurai came out and they kind of took control of it. And eventually over time, and Okinawa was really under the thumb of Japan for quite some time before it even became kind of officially incorporated into the nation state. Ethnically, Okinawans are very different. There's lots of Okinawan languages that are, like, my mom is an Okinawan language speaker. She speaks Uchinaguji. And so, they're very, like, if you look at the architecture, it's very, very, and the kimonos and the clothes of Okinawans, very, very different. Practices of like having shamans and women shamans, and the hajichi tattooings, these indigenous tattooings that became stigmatized when Japan took over, are really a clue to, how ethnically different Okinawa is culturally. Over time, like I said, Japan kind of saw Okinawa as this second class people, like, people who were so othered and different because of their practices, indigenous practices, their shamanism, their way of being, and try to erase a lot of those things. And a lot of the kind of woman-led practices went underground, as they do in so many countries that are colonized by very powerful kinds of systems. During when World War II was gearing up, there are so many theories. People who study military history say that Japan specifically brought their Navy and Army to Okinawa as a way of kind of drawing the U.S. to Okinawa as a sacrifice. I think when we're talking about some of these, Okinawa as a space, you can see that it's so layered, right? There's so palimpsest of so many histories and stances of negotiating, and it's been positioned as, a touristic place by mainland Japan today. They think of it as like a destination, as a tourist destination, as like they call it the Hawaii of Japan, right?
Oh my.
I mean, the palm trees that are there are not native to Okinawa. They brought them in to tropicalize it, right? So it's being positioned in so many different ways, as a military site, as a tourist site. But, when I talk to my family members, for instance, they are scrappy people. Like, they have figured out how to make do with even military scraps, right? That's part of resilience in surviving. And they will still go, like, all of the rituals that are there. Like, there's so many Okinawan indigenous rituals of paying homage to your family. It's very different from other parts of Japan, where it's so much as ancestor worship. So all of the little the gyoji, the rituals that you do at the tomb, these massive turtle tombs, they call them, where all your ancestors' ashes are there and you've been cremated. Those rituals of belonging they still persist. People gathered their bones from the tombs that are now military bases, right? They had to go and remove the bones, take them, and create new sources of community. So there's resilience in terms of the rituals that still persist. Here's an example. When I was in Okinawa last, my uncles and aunties, they took me to a community undokai, which is like a sports festival. And I was like, oh, this is I was thinking in my head, oh, this is just for the people in the neighborhood. And my auntie was like, no, this is our old neighborhood where we were displaced. These are all the people from the place that's now, like, if you fly into Naha, you're flying into my family's displaced land. that was
oh my gosh.
Yeah. And so that whole, they have a book of all the plots, like the map of all the homes and the names of all the people who used to live in that community. And they gather frequently as a way of saying, we still know, you have your maps, we have our maps, we know whose land, who belonged on that land. So there's that connection to the land is not gone just because the people aren't there anymore. It still exists in the memories, but also in these lived practices of memory, of memorialization in these festivals. There's this kind of communal remembrance of the land that you're displaced from. And that is, to me, was a huge testament of resiliency, of like, you can push us off, but we remember. And this is how we remember. And that, I think, is happening in so many of these communities in this grant, which is, in Overtown to, when you're dealing with gentrification processes, right? People would be pushed off, but they're like, yes, but we've created community there. We remember, I think, paying attention to that kind of grounded feeling of resistance and fire, and also that everyday kinds of remembrance practices are all together a form of potential resilience and resistance at the same time.
Yeah.
Did that make sense? I'm sorry.
It made.
If you hear me talking on Okinawa,
No, yeah, it made a lot of sense. Thank you so much for sharing. You covered a lot of the questions I was gonna ask. I really like the parallels you made about the resilience of having somebody come into your home and kind of press their culture on you, yet still finding a way to maintain and preserve those cultural traditions. I thought about that in terms of that pressure of having to conform to American or white or Western, and even in Okinawa's case, Japanese, just other, an other identity. I was thinking about how that affects the ability of immigrant, Indigenous, Black, Asian communities, and how they're able to maintain and preserve those cultural connections and traditions. And I love that you touched on that about how even though Okinawa has been so militarized, there is still a presence of making sure that these cultural traditions and norms and values are still a part of society. And I love that so much. Yeah, so I want to go back to something that you said earlier about this common sense of oppression, right? And how it can bring people together. What's that shared interplay of oppression on the environment and society and people?
How can they come together?
Yeah, like how do those similar dynamic affect like a collaborative resilience,
I think it's happening already. There's always been this kind of acknowledgement that, people all over the world who identify as Indigenous are being impacted in similar ways, right? They're being read in similar ways as sacrificable people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the erasures are so intense, not just for Indigenous people, but we see this happen, here in our state, right? Exactly. And so we recognize that, I think, in each other's histories and paths to not be erased, right? The fight to be included of the making of these countries and our nation states. And that's always a hard fight, no matter where you are, where a dominant, people who benefit from those dominant narratives are terrified, right, of real change. Exactly. And inclusivity. And so they continue to make those erasures complete, right? Exactly. And so that resilience effort that is worldwide is, I think, based on these ideas, like, no, you're not going to do that. And I think the lessons learned are like, how are folks fighting those erasures? And it's not just from the top, though, right? It's happening on the ground. Yeah, it has to. It's got to be all around, but we need allies who are really within and who are quiet. They're listening. They need to listen, right? And just be engaged and develop true relationships with Indigenous communities. Just say, hey, I've got this Indigenous friend and he told me this. And so this is what, no, it's like really making that effort to be a part of the communities. If you're a journalist, writing about, if you're an educator, like including more Indigenous material into the syllabus and not just saying, I'm going to do a land acknowledgement, I'm done, no checkbox stuff. Let's get to the real kind of ways of letting go of some of our privilege and being uncomfortable.
Exactly.
Real histories, right? Diverse histories, and fight and trying not to be fearful of the climate that can punish you for speaking up. And that's the way I think our youth are, like I said earlier, fire. Thinking about these are some activists on the ground who are just killing it and finding ways through either social media to talk to each other. They're creating beautiful content that is moving the knowledge ticker a little bit.
I think that we could really do something, because I feel like a lot of non-Western societies are naturally connected to the environment, and they have a long-standing ancestral relationship with the environment and taking care of it. if we all just came together and we're like, we're going to protect our environment together, and stand up to these people, I think that that's where the real change is going to happen. And I'm optimistic that if it's not my generation, it will be the generation after us. I see it coming soon. So yeah, I want to know what your hopes for the future are.
As I start to, as I became more engaged with organizations on the ground and listening to students, and I'm fighting that pessimistic side because I see these really beautiful moments of organizing despite all the challenges that are there to shackle people down. I'm hopeful that all the people can blow away that smoke and see it for what it really is. The ways that they are in solidarity with Black communities in South Florida is so beautiful to me. And so I see those things and I'm like, okay, yes, this is my beacon of like hope. This is what is to come. I hope from more, crossover. So, and
that's my hope. Yeah.
That's my hope. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. I really, really enjoyed
it too. So much.
As we wrap up this episode, consider how we can draw inspiration from Okinawa and South Florida Indigenous communities to cultivate initiatives that both sustain and protect our cultural identities in the face of adversity. And as always, what are your hopes for the future, and how can you challenge yourself to become an advocate for change? Until next time, continue exploring, questioning, and advocating for a world where justice is the common thread weaving us all together. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Commons for Justice podcast.